Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining to the last of our Anatomy of a Crisis Life Goes On broadcasts this year. Thank you very much for joining. My name's Tom Holmes from Brand Performance. As you know, we're a leading HR and finance transformation consultancy. And throughout the pandemic, from the start, we have been interviewing HRDs and leaders and thought leaders in organizations from almost every sector. I've now done, I think, 30 of these broadcasts this year, each of which I have learned one or more really useful and interesting facts from. And I'm really excited about this being the last one for this year for a number of reasons, including the fact of my wonderful guests who I'll introduce in a second. But it's great to see so many of you here this morning and so many of you who have been to many of those broadcasts. So I'm really excited about this being the last one for this year. So thank you for joining. As always, down the bottom, there is a Q&A button, and I'd welcome your questions, which we'll take as we go through the conversation today. So please fire away on any questions you want to ask or any comments you want to make for our panelists. So with that, I'd like to introduce our two panelists, and we have today, which is fantastic, David Peach, who is the MD at River Mercantile, which is an investment appraiser and asset manager, something like that. David, you'll give us a bit more detail in a second. And I would also like to introduce Olivia Sinfield, who is the Associate Director at Osborne, Clarke, which is an international law firm, as most of you will know. Both of our representatives today are students and experts in the future of work. So good morning, David.
Good morning. Thanks, Tom.
Could you explain a little bit better what River Mercantile do?
Yeah, well, just to clarify that I'm a joiner during lockdown, so I've actually only been with the firm six months, so I've had that experience. But River Mercantile is an investment management and pensions advisory business, so institutional clients mainly.
Great. Okay, so now and Olivia, welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Tom. Good to be here, as ever.
Great. And can you tell us a bit more about Osborne Clarke before we kick off?
Yeah, of course. So as you said, Tom, so we're an international law firm. For my sins, I'm an employment lawyer. So, and in that capacity, I've been talking a lot to clients about the future of work for a couple of years now, but always then with an element of crystal ball gazing. Whereas, now the future of work, it's gone from one of those nice, let's talk about it over the dinner table conversations to something very real that's impacting on clients and throwing up things that they need to be considering now, which is obviously what we're going to talk about today.
Yes, I think that what the key observation is this year from an HR perspective, I think, is that a lot has happened. A lot of things which might have we thought about previously have occurred, and obviously there's an enormous amount of change. So today, what we're intending to do is reflect a little bit on what we believed the future of work was going to be some years ago and how much of that has come to pass. Then look at the current position and what we're seeing, what trends, etc., which Olivia is working on at the moment, what's actually happening in the market, what is actually changing, what we need to be looking forward to and looking out for. And then finally, some reflections as to what we see as the positive and potential out of the new world which we'll be emerging into in the new year and over the next months. So with that in mind, can I start with asking you, David, about I'm fully aware that about 10 years ago you did a quite a substantial white paper and piece of work on what you believed the future of work was going to be. and I'm really curious as to how much, what was in there, how much of it's come true, how much of it turned out to be a load of old baloney, and what your reflections are actually on that assessment all those years ago, given with a 10-year kind of perspective backwards. So if we start there, that would be a great thing. So David, tell us about that piece of work.
Well, first of all, just stop me if I go off rambling, because I tend to when I start talking about this. But put it into context, 10 years ago, I was working for the New York Stock Exchange Group, and my boss, the CEO, mixed with the great and the good at Davos every year. There were a lot of listed businesses. So the relationship with the clients meant that there was a lot of association with the CEOs of some of the biggest companies in the world. And I also, at the same time, was doing a master's in which I was focusing on sort of leadership, and it was mainly around the future of leadership, which of course reflected the future of work. So that was the context. And you cast your mind back to 2010, 2 years post-financial crisis, 10 years of a litany of corporate failures, starting with sort of Enron in 2001, plus 9 or 10 other large corporations, ending with the financial crisis. And I think ultimately, around about 2010, there was a kind of crisis of trust in the system, in corporates, and during the sort of studies I was doing, I looked at a sort of global market research, and societally, I think that the data was showing about in wealthy countries, so Western countries, this is mainly, about 56% of people over the age of 25 up to the age of 70 were starting to show trends as employees in a lack of trust with business, lack of trust in government, looking for a better quality of life, looking to simplify their lives, and looking to have more purpose in their life. So this is sort of a societal trend that we usually attribute to Gen Y, Gen Z, millennials. People like to badge it, but really it was everybody of a working age. An increasing number of people of a working age were starting to feel this way. So you've got the sort of industry trend of sort of corporate failure. You've got a societal trend of people starting to mistrust business. And of course, at the same time, you had globalization that was in full swing, or probably coming towards the end of globalization, where businesses were trying to create scale. So really, people were becoming commoditized again. So I think that's the sort of scenario in which I wrote that paper. And so the reaction of business, and we can still see it today in terms of our own regulator, the FCA, was to start talking about shared purpose, about authenticity, about values, and about providing their employees with a sort of a quality of life is probably not the right word, but certainly a more agility about how we use people in terms of applying people to pieces of work rather than having a workforce into which you feed work. So it's really sort of flipping the employment contract to one where people had more flexibility, more freedom, more autonomy about their work.
And that is very interesting, because that is something which I think we've seen, which is that rather than a move away from a scenario where you start at the bottom of a profession within a firm and then end up somewhere in the middle to the top of that same profession, instead as coalescing into work teams and projects and activities where we're expected to bring our capabilities and skills to them, but it isn't a linear exercise of getting better and better at the same thing over decades, right, David?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that there was a tension. So the tension, especially in older, more well-established firms, there's a tension because they're still trying to raise efficiency. That sort of formula of profit is greater output with less input. So people would still attempt to commoditize. So you've got certainly in the UK economy, a lot more small businesses growing, a lot more startup businesses, where you are seeing this sort of new way of working being applied. And then you've got much more well-established firms, and I include most of financial services in that, who are sort of struggling to try and keep things as they were, to keep this sort of input and output model right. We need greater output, but more efficiency, automation, technology, and that increasing commoditization. So I think you've got a real tension over the last 2 years. And I suppose what my view is that whilst we were moving in that direction, it was a slow and sort of stumbling journey. And potentially what we've seen this year is a sort of, a lot of the barriers have been removed. And so, what I suppose answering your question and what has actually come to fruition from that. I mean, we were looking at what I refer back to what I said. So shared purpose, common goals, values, and this sort of flexible way of applying a workforce. Those things were all ideas at the time, and people used to quote, the firms like Google and Gore and all of these firms who have this sort of slightly different approach to work as the sort of utopia. But 10 years later, or 9 years later, not many firms, certainly established business, had really moved in that direction. They'd all nibbled away at the edges, but there was still the sort of pressure, particularly if they were listed, from shareholders to maintain the sort of, the profit output input model.
I mean, there's a couple of things. I mean, which I'm picking up from what you're saying there, David. One, which is I'm really interested in, which is that at that period, post the 2008 crisis, there was actually quite a push to look again at regulation, look again at how corporate governance was working, and re-examine that some of the risks which businesses had been taking previously were then seen as inappropriate, or clearly had not worked. And I wonder whether we're not seeing a not dissimilar trend at the moment. I mean, the last few weeks, there's been a very significant push in the US about Facebook and other organizations' use of data. In the last week, we've seen some very significant data losses which have occurred in the US, which are, and I see that the European Union is looking again at the IT firms and the use of personal data and all this stuff. And frankly, I think over the last year, we've all probably been more cavalier with our personal data than we were previously. And it's starting to kind of matter. With us all spending all day on Zoom, etc., the fact that immediately, the fact that I've just said regulation will probably pop up a regulatory tool set in my Amazon basket in about 10 minutes time. It's becoming quite apparent, and I'm quite interested in that. I think there's a very strong case that the changes which the crisis has brought as to which firms are successful and less successful, and which are failing and which are succeeding, which we're seeing on a large scale, is going to lead to another look at regulations and the drive to push tighter regulation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we have started to see it come through in the corporate governance codes and the FCA's regulations around, engagement and purpose and all of these things that the regulators and the FRC talk about as things that boards need to be doing. It's certainly for listed business. But really, they are. It's 10 years later, and we're seeing those come through in the last 2 years, probably 2.5 years, maybe 3 years if you're in a bank. But it's kind of interesting that there's that lag, and actually, when I was studying it 10 years ago, people were talking about stakeholders. Were also employees were one of the 4 key stakeholder branches. Employees had to be engaged as part of a sort of this new world, and I think employees haven't really been part of that equation. And my suggestion is that they are now. We have now, and maybe Olivia wants to comment on this, but from a legal point of view, I think employees now have more power than they've had since Margaret Thatcher repealed most of the trade union acts, because the employees it's a matter of safety, and people have now shown that the way we're working can work in most cases. So it's now up to employers what to do.
So what I'm taking from that, David, is you are saying the changes to the way we've been working over the last year have been accelerated by employees' wishes and choices, some of them enforced upon those employees, but other ones actually independent. And that is a very interesting take, that because the period you're talking about is not 10 years ago, that's kind of 30, 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. The issue, I think, is that the difference in my mind is that was an organized employee voice at that time. And now we have a not chaotic, but a disparate employee voice. It's much harder to track what that employee voice is than it was when there was an organized representatives who would represent them and explain what that was. And I think that's very interesting. So with that, I'm quite keen actually to move on from those reflections and on to Olivia, because Olivia, you've been working on assessing what the current position is, what employees and companies are saying. And I know you've got an infographic which you're going to share with us. So I'm very excited about hearing about what the here and now is.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that was really interesting, David. And actually linking into your thinking back approach, I can't help but cast my mind back to, it was around March 2018, so almost 2 years to the day before we went into our first lockdown. There was an article in the Times by the then Employment Minister, Alok Sharma, saying the future of work is now. So back in 2018, but little did he know what was going to happen fast forward 2 years later. So the stage we're at now, and the work we've been doing over recent months, is very much identifying practical issues that will impact on businesses as employers of the future, but which we think need to be, well, actually must be on business radars now, where the groundwork needs to be done, the foundations need to be put in place, upon which businesses can then build their COVID exit strategies and work towards the reimagination of the workplace and workforce, which David was talking about. So, as you said, Tom, I think the best way to show you the future of work issues that we've identified as being most likely to fast track to the top of business agendas is if I can walk you through the infographic. Mm-hmm. And now, by the wonders of modern technology, it should be appearing on your screens in front of you. So the intention is we produce this to help clients navigate around the key issues. And we've broken down future of work into these 5 subcategories: employer of the future, worker of the future, jobs, office workspace, and homes workspace, and set out against each are 6 key predictions in respect of what is likely to happen going forwards. So just to show you, Zoe, if you could click on employer of the future. Appreciate they're kind of in a simplified overview, but it's very much intended to be used as a talking point, and not all of these will apply to all businesses. It's a case of deciding, using this as a starting point and deciding which are relevant to your business, and then hopefully this will enable you to go on and have a deeper dive. So I thought it might be useful just to flag, if it's okay, Tom, with you, some of the key issues that are of most interest or relevant to our clients.
Absolutely, now. Olivia, give us 2 or 3 in each of those areas.
Yeah, that's fine. I thought they might resonate with the audience today. So in relation to employer of the future, I think the first one I'd like to pick up on, because it links as well with what you were talking then, Tom, about data protection, is we're seeing a real changing approach from businesses in relation to risk management, with the recognition that there is a real need going forward for businesses to be increasingly crisis prepared, risk prepared and ready. So, we're all used to talking before about, well, what is a business's appetite for risk? Whereas now we're in the territory of, risk not really being your cup of tea isn't an option. And the real survivors and winners throughout all of this and going forwards are going to be the businesses who are accurately now predicting what the key risks are and responding to those. And I think now we've seen a real dramatic shift in the landscape of risk over the last couple of months. So we used to talk about, the key risks were more the mainstream ones like fire, terrorist attack, data hacking, and anyone who foresaw the likes of a virus. I don't know whether you remember, there was a Bill Gates TED talk back in 2015, were kind of dismissed as conspiracy theorists. But now there's a real desire amongst businesses, I think, to make sure this doesn't happen again, and that businesses then aren't going to be caught flat-footed like many were back in March. So we're seeing some sort of new and different risks emerging. Tom, you picked up on a key one, I think, in relation to data protection. The concern here from our clients is everyone's moving towards using creative, new advanced AI tech solutions, which of course offer huge transformational promise. But then if they're not implemented properly, there's also the possibility of data breach if those safeguards aren't in place. There's new health and safety risks around when we're getting employees back into the workplace, whether offices and premises are COVID secure. There's risks on the tax front. We're seeing them emerging now when we've got a whole host of employees who've headed out to their place in the sun and are sitting on beaches over abroad, but have been there so long now that actually they should be being paid under local tax laws and jurisdictions. So there's all of these new different risks emerging, and then you've got issues like climate change, geopolitical risks, higher stakeholder expectations around social responsibility following Black Lives Matter and hashtag Me Too this year. So it's really, I think, taken businesses to the point where we have to be moving away from this sort of more static and formulaic view of risks and being much more proactive around it.
Okay. So that's employers. How about workers, Olivia?
Yeah, so workers, there's a couple of different ones. I think the key one it would be wrong to have a session like this without touching on it, is the main legacy of the pandemic. And David was talking about where we were 10 years ago, is in terms of employees wanting or expecting more flexibility, and the likelihood that hybrid working is certainly going to become more normal than it was pre-COVID, when I agree with David, flexible working was more by exception only. I think the best sign that this is here to stay is last week the English Dictionary announced that they're putting the acronym WFH into the latest updated version, in addition to the words furlough, lockdown and circuit breaker. So there's a great Christmas gift for the kids. But I think just to mention as well, there's some really interesting stats emerging at the moment around the sort of current thinking from businesses around hybrid working and what this is going to look like. So I saw Deutsche Bank, they've said, after conducting an employee survey, that 33% of their workers want to work from home 2 days a week, and this drops off to 4% for 4 or 5 days. And closer to home, within OC, we undertook a similar survey, and ours found that 58% of our employees wanted to work from home 2 to 3 days, but it dropped to 15% for 4 to 5 days. So kind of aligns with Deutsche's findings as well. Loads more stats out there, but they all do seem to support the concept going forwards of a desire for more blended working, not going to a fully 100% remote working model, but going to this hybrid model, 1 foot in the workplace and 1 foot at home. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves.
If I average that out, Olivia, it sounds like your research, Deutsche and the other teams, are suggesting that it's going to be kind of half capacity in those people who have a choice and where they can work from home, that we'd be looking at a kind of like 50% capacity, so 2 or 3 days a week, whereas the fully from home work is almost as unpopular as ever.
I think so. I think at the moment the direction of travel, certainly from employees, seems to be, yes, they like working from home. They can be productive, they can do the work, but in terms of that employee experience and being able to collaborate and communicate and socialize with colleagues, that's when they want to be in the workplace. And that's where this blended idea of working comes in. So it's slightly have your cake and eat it. And I think the stage a lot of businesses are at is there is the realization, there's been, you know, all of these surveys happening that employees want change, but they haven't quite worked out what that change means for their business or how that's going to be put into effect. We've seen a kind of couple of early announcements from, actually, interestingly, more traditional white collar businesses. Law firms like Norton Rose, Schroders, Standard Chartered have all been sort of front runners in coming out and announcing that they are moving to a more flexible working model. And I think that's quite interesting because they were the ones that traditionally, I think, would probably have been more nervous about introducing agile working. So whether there's sort of an element of wanting to get in first with these announcements probably is,
well, that's true. I mean, I was surprised too. So one of the early broadcasts was with the HRD of Norton Rose, and their view was absolutely that the partners in their organisation had completely changed their take on things. In fact, it's whereas they previously said this is not possible, then it is a proven case that it was possible, and that actually in some areas it proved significantly beneficial, such as actually billing percentages, not because people were doing more hours, but because people were recording their time on the day they did it and not waiting till the end of the week. And that I think was very interesting. So, but I'm also picking up on the difficulty now of predicting what our employees and colleagues want, partly from what David was describing, where that single voice as to who speaks for employees is gone, but also what you're describing, Olivia, which is that actually there's a multitude of different desires and ways of working and thoughts about this, which is very hard to disentangle into a single trend.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think the issue is for businesses to try and grapple with is obviously every person's view in terms of what they want and what they want their working experience to be is different to their colleagues. Probably never going to get to a point where you're going to have 100% on board at the whole time. But it's how businesses align that, their expectations, wants, needs and desires with actually what they consider is the best model for the business as well going forwards. And as I said, I just don't think we're quite at the point where most businesses are able to say this is what is going to work for us as we go beyond 2021.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So on to the jobs of the future. So what do we need to be doing to modify our jobs, Olivia?
Yeah, jobs of the future is a really interesting one. So I think we've seen this year that the really strong forces of not just COVID, but the huge rapid advances in AI, robotics are having a really huge impact on the type of jobs people are doing and how they do them. So we've seen a real shift in terms of jobs that are most in demand. A lot of these are temporary trends such as medical research, telework, delivery drivers, but we are seeing some new sort of more permanent changes with the emergence of new roles like some come up with some great titles as well. Head of Employee Experience, I've come across. Head of Diversity and Inclusion. There's a huge demand for D&I leaders at the moment. Remote working advisors probably didn't exist as a role 12 months ago. Data protection officers as well. They are really highly in demand. And I think what's interesting as well is as a result of this, how businesses are going to address A, recruitment, but B, looking at upskilling, retraining their current workforce to be able to take on board these sort of new roles, new job requirements without having to go down the redundancy route. So there's a huge focus at the moment on the whole learning and development piece, which I think is a trend that's going to gather momentum going forwards.
I mean, we've got a question from the audience about how actually, in terms of jobs, but also going back a step in terms of workers, that one of the things which is less apparent in the new world is how well people are doing their job or not. So are they working differentially, with some people working very hard and other people working less hard, and are the jobs equalized, etc.? We used to know, because the guy sitting next to me might have been useless, but he was there all day, from 8 till 6, and we all knew that, and we could play to individuals' skills and their capabilities by kind of balancing things in that kind of way. But how do we, what are your thoughts about making these jobs fair and making rewards and related components to that fair, given that people are now in very different environments and circumstances?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I think gives rise to a sort of couple of thoughts. First of all, what we're seeing is sort of a really rapid take up of tech solutions around the whole employee monitoring and surveillance piece, when businesses are trying really to sort of keep a track on what their workforce are doing. I think the bigger picture issue as well is that businesses now going forwards need to get better at data gathering. So, as businesses are looking at being able to monitor remote workforces, and as they're exploring new working models going forwards, there's also that realization that actually we don't really fully understand the capabilities of our workforce. So, for example, we realize now that digital skills are crucial going forwards, and we need those, but we don't know how to spot digital potential amongst our employees, or how to identify who has the potential to upskill or reskill. So I think businesses really have to get to grips with how they are going to gather this data about their workforce. Otherwise, all of this discussions around future of work will just be a slightly nebulous concept.
What do you make of that, David?
Well, I think I don't think I think we overestimate our capacity to measure people's performance when they're at work. Actually, my experience for the last 20 years is that we're not very good at it, and there are plenty of people in the firms that I've worked at in the past whose output is significantly lower than the person sitting next to them, and that comes down to leadership and management. And I think what we've probably not talked about, and I'm sure maybe Olivia's going to talk about it, is that that's going to be incredibly complex going forward. So if we're not very good at it when people are actually in the office, then how good are we going to be at it when we've got a semi-remote workforce that probably only convene once, all together once a month or once every 2 weeks? And that's going to be a real challenge in terms of developing leaders and what are we looking for in leaders. And again, it probably comes back to something that I looked at before. Managing complexity and managing the sort of ability to be slightly less structured environments is going to be a key going forward than traditional management skills.
Yes, and I would add to that what we've seen over the last 9 months is a great acceleration of things happening. We're not, the hospitality businesses in London, for example, entering tier 3, were given precisely, I think, 4 days notice that was going to occur. And that is 4 days to make incredibly complicated and difficult changes to their business plans, particularly at this time of year with deliveries coming and stuff like that. But my point is not to talk about that specifically, but the fact that our leaders are having to deal with seismic changes on a daily, weekly and monthly basis, which previously they might have had 6 months or a year to plan for and make that change.
I think that's really interesting point, and I completely agree, David, in that this is having huge knock-on effects in terms of our expectations about leadership and management, and the idea that actually we are looking now to our leaders to be able to demonstrate empathy. And it's so much more important to be able to do that when we have people working remotely. And I think what's happened in terms of general trend is the focus early doors was so much on survival and getting the tech solutions right, which was so important to enable remote working. And I think businesses mobilise really quickly and effectively on that front. Whereas now we're in the territory of we need to make sure those people practices and people processes are in place to enable, you know, what we need going forwards, the collaboration, the communication, career development. And we're not quite there yet. So there needs to be a lot more work on retraining, you know, particularly those who are at the front line in dealing with people. I think, you know, David, you're in HR. I think HR is a great example there, and managers in as well, with, for example, you know, fairly practical things like new projects. We need to have cross-team approaches rather than giving it to one person to encourage collaboration. We need to make sure there's real-time positive and negative messaging and feedback being given to individuals. Otherwise, I think in a virtual workplace, it's very difficult to have those tricky day-to-day conversations, and otherwise they may get avoided, and we all know where that ends up. So yeah, I think there is a real piece that needs a lot more sort of focus as we go forwards around this.
Yes, and then with, you know, this speed of change without necessarily knowing the implications is a huge challenge for leadership. I mean, if I think about the legal profession, the drop or the removal of the kind of formula for pay scale and reward, which has been relied upon for decades, which, Olivia, you know much more about than I do, but the formula, which is that, you know, certain pay boundaries exist according to the time you've been in an organization and the length of time you've been a partner, etc., are now being removed very rapidly by many of the big firms because of competitive pressures from organizations who don't have those boundaries and will pay a top performer whatever that top performer deserves. And I think that kind of mobility, that kind of change, that's the kind of change which we would previously have expected the British law firms to take 20 or 30 years over feathering in and bringing and assessing and all that stuff.
Years of research, yeah.
If you haven't done it by Christmas, you almost get a lame duck in the law profession.
Yeah.
And yes, a lot of people have been talking about, from an HR professional's perspective, the idea, or one of the potential things which we need to be considering is automating and putting aside the basic processes which have taken up so much of our time and lives in the past, so that we can create space for these more complicated and bigger changes. Because, you know, I don't know about you guys, but my perception in HR is that we've been kind of doing the same thing repetitively in many of our roles now for many years. And it's the same thing every week and every month. And actually, because we're now being asked to deal with seismic and significant changes, to think about the future of our business and our employees, etc., on a month and weekly basis, we need to create space to be able to have that thinking time.
I agree. I think we've just as well got to be very aware of the impact that can have on different sectors of the workforce. So, you know, relying on automation to take over the sort of more day-to-day mundane tasks can have a great impact on the sort of more the younger, the more junior, the lower paid workers. So then we need to think about, right, there's this pool of available talent there. What are we going to do in terms of upskilling and reskilling them, so we don't end up with, as we go towards 2025, a sort of pocket of really aggrieved, unhappy people. But I completely take your point in terms of thinking, particularly say around compensation. businesses are having to look at the moment, wrestle with, well, what's our compensation strategy going to be? How does that fit in with our workplace strategy as well as our work people strategy? So there are all these different strands that are trying to tie together, and which is the key driver? How do they all interact? So, and at the same time as wanting to take our employees on this journey with us. So, you know, there's no point driving the bus if we don't have any passengers there. So there, it is without doubt, it's a very tricky task ahead.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That angle about fairness, I think, is very is of great interest, because people have different capacities and capabilities, different levels of experience, and actually to be building their capabilities in this world is going to be very different from what it was before, and challenging. I think that interests me, David. I don't know about you.
Well, I'll just come back to your point, Tom, about sort of streamlining processes, etc. I think if you do it the right way, it's clearly quite valuable. I think it comes back to the point about commoditization of people. If you introduce sort of hideously complex self-service and appraisal systems that kind of make your employees feel like they are kind of commodities, and that they are effectively having to take over the lion's share of the work that the HR department used to do. But obviously with modern technology, if you can use those enhancements, the streamlining of those processes to engage your workforce at a very, before they've even joined, actually, and most of the technology that I'm seeing in the last year or so, having tried to implement new systems and not getting the budgetary approval, of course, is that they are engagement tools in their own right, and that's critical and I think it applies to any process enhancement. If you are using them to engage both the people from an HR point of view that you're asking to use them, but also the HR team who are using them, then I think they've become very, very successful tools, and that's quite critical.
That's quite interesting. I think engagement, but also empowerment. I think for each person who loves getting a letter and a personal hand-holding conversation with HR to get their details and stuff like that right, there's another person who thinks this is ridiculous. I just want to go online and get this sorted out like I would do on my profiles on my other applications and other tools I use. Which again is speaking, Olivia, to this splitting up, this fracturing of our workplace and our colleagues' needs and requirements, which I think is, this fracturizing of our firm. You could say that reward stuff in law firms, those changes are actually fracturing of requirements of people. That's what that's doing. It's creating all of these things are creating organizations which are more in groups of individuals and less herds of employees. It's the opposite of herd immunity.
I like the analogy.
So that's yes. So my third topic was and my final thoughts really today are about actually going back into the real distant past and looking at the last time in which we had a significant health crisis of this nature, which actually is, we all know it's kind of 1918 during the period of the Spanish flu, which, the more I look at pictures of that, etc., the more familiar it looks. It used to look incredibly distant and strange, seeing all these people wearing masks and stuff like that in the street back in 1918. But that's exactly what we look like now, which I find extraordinary. But the characteristic, and what I'm really interested in today, as this is our last broadcast this year, is that 1918 was followed by a huge revolution in living standards, productivity, and the Roaring Twenties almost directly preceded 1918. By the time we recovered from the flu, business world, the commercial world, the media world, the entertainment world was completely different from what it was previously, to enormous benefit to the world. Do you see the same thing happening this time? Are we on the cusp of real significant changes and beneficial changes which are going to drive our economy very positively, or do you see it as different from that? David, should we go to you first? What are your thoughts?
That's a tough one. I don't think it will be as significant as the 20s. I think, if anything, and I come back to this point about people wanting, I suppose, a reassessment over the last year of what's important in terms of their day-to-day lives, and it possibly could be from a societal point of view, it could be more of a simplification of people's lives, and less clutter in terms of media or social media, or so that sort of simplification, which obviously has then impacts on all of these things that have grown up around us in the last sort of 10 or 15 years when it comes to the sort of media sector. I think we're, from a sort of capitalist machine point of view, I think we're on a journey. I think possibly where there's too much politically and financially at stake to change that trajectory significantly. But I do think what may be accelerated, to your point earlier, was and to Olivia's point around things like ESG and climate change, and the change in all of these things that they were sort of accelerating before COVID, but I think people have paid much more attention to them over the last sort of year, and I only get that from sitting in the financial services industry, where you are getting a lot of this coming through in both in regulation but also in customer demand from an institutional customer. From institutional customers, and also from wholesale customers who are dealing with the public. So I kind of feel that there's going to be a sort of shift that was due to happen 10 years, 15 years ago, and it's kind of been accelerated, which is, I think, so it doesn't really answer your question, but yeah, is it going to be the Roaring Twenties? Yeah.
It does in one critical way, which is that what you've been describing, David and Olivia, is trends which we knew were on the cusp or should be occurring, but never seemed to happen, having been accelerated vastly in this year. I'm not hearing in the list of things which, Olivia, you've been describing, or the list of things, David, which you were working on 10 years ago defining, I'm not hearing anything new or earth-shatteringly different from those predictions. But what I'm seeing is an enormous acceleration of those factors and those trends over the last 9 months. And I wonder whether that acceleration itself is a permanent force, that actually the thing which will change post the crisis, etc., is that we are going to need to continue to work at the kind of pace of change which we've seen over the last 9 months, and that there would not be a return, at least for successful businesses, to their kind of steady the ship, business as usual position. Olivia, have you got any final thoughts on that area and what the future holds for us?
Yeah, I think, I'm a child of I hate to admit to it, I'm a child of the 70s. So back in the era where not everyone got a prize at sports day. So I do think there's going to be winners and losers coming out of all of these. So we're going to see some survivors, other thrivers, and unfortunately businesses that fall into neither camp. I think the winners coming out of all this are going to be the businesses that move at pace, as you say, that show resilience, have an ability to adapt and adapt quickly, are flexible, imaginative and creative in terms of the way they're responding to the challenges and opportunities that COVID and digitalisation throw up, and the ones that engage and bring their people on the journey with them. I think I'd probably say I believe we are on the cusp of a key moment in terms of future of work, and I think things like hybrid working, diversity and inclusion, the developments we've seen there, as well as you mentioned ESG, sustainability, decarbonisation, digitalisation, all huge changes which, as you say, Tom, have been greatly accelerated over this year. I hope the pace slightly calms down, because otherwise I think this notion of everyone burning out is going to come true. But yeah, no, I think there are exciting times ahead.
Yes, yeah. Well, thank you very much. That was an incredibly interesting conversation today, which I really enjoyed. I think that clearly what you are both telling me is that we need to prepare for more change in the new year. It's going to be tough and accelerated, and we need to work on our resilience. So what I would like to do is thank both our panelists and all of our audience for taking time out of today, and suggest that we all try and take a good break over the holiday period, and actually work on our own resilience and thoughts for the new year. We're not going to get a chance, because it sounds like it's going to be pretty full on when we're all back in January. So thank you very much, panelists. It was great for you both to join.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
And audience, thank you very much. It was great that so many of you have joined so many times, and I'm seeing messages popping in thanking us, and I'd like to wish you all a very happy holiday, and I hope that you get as much rest and recuperation and preparation for a big new year. So thank you very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you on our next series of webinars in the early new year. So thank you very much, and have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.